This episode is brought to you by Eerie.fm, the best way to listen to this show and all of my narrations. For $8 a month, you can become a premium member and listen to hours of exclusive narrations from me that you can't find anywhere else. Narrations like Dogwood, a horror novel audiobook with over 6 hours of terrifying Georgia wilderness, and Southern Gothic noir. Just go to EERIE.fm to listen now. That's Eerie.fm, the home of horror audio. The Skinwalker returns in today's extremely unsettling story, sent in by someone named Gabario Cart, a story titled, "The Government is Covering Up Skinwalkers." In this story, a man who is a contracted hunter on BLM land stumbles upon a disturbing encounter that leaves him changed forever. But he's not the only one who knows the truth. Don't be the one who cries, Skinwalker. I never thought I'd be a whistleblower, especially reaching out to a podcast of all places to blow that whistle, so to speak. And yet, here I am. I appreciate you taking the time to review this. I've got no idea if this will reach any ears. I've used a pen name for this story to remain anonymous, and none of the real names will match up. Most folks don't actually believe in skinwalkers. That's just a kid's bedtime story or a viral topic on the internet that has no basis in the real world. Those people are lucky, because they can sleep pretty well at night. There's also a good chunk of folks who refuse to speak of it, because they know how very real it is. And while I understand that sentiment, would you not feel duty-bound to report a serial killer in the woods, a kidnapper in our parks, especially if you witnessed it firsthand? I don't want to come off sounding crazy, but I pretty much have no other choice. What I'm about to tell you is the craziest and most mind-altering experience, or rather series of events, of my life. A person has likely never gone from ghosts and monsters are fake Hollywood drivel to, oh yeah, them suckers are real, faster than this guy. So, I've got a dream job, especially for the dudes out there. I hunt for a living, and I don't mean living off of elk bone stew in some 200 square foot cabin in the middle of nowhere. I'm no hermit. I'm actually contracted by the government, specifically the BLM, which stands for Bureau of Land Management. They pay me to basically live in the woods for weeks at a time, sometimes even months, hunting or trapping whichever animal population they find problematic. They've got dozens of bunkhouses and field stations in the land I operated in, some basically just little trailers on cinder blocks. But when you're being paid to sleep there and do your favorite thing in the world, there's not really much room to complain. This was back in the 90s. I dropped out of college my first year. I'd been going for a degree in childhood education. Funny, huh? And I moved back in with my mom looking for work. I looked for the basic starter stuff at first, like dishwashing for local restaurants or maybe trying not to die of heat stroke at a metal factory. From a high school friend, I learned something interesting. We often talk about things at night, and the conversation moved on to which job would you take even if it paid basically nothing. And I had replied that I wished I could live in the woods and hunt for a living. Then he told me that is actually a thing. The government actually hires folks to cull animal populations on BLM land. But getting a contract like that is extremely difficult. My mind was made up right there, though, because up to that point I had no idea I could even do that. I thought forest work started and ended at the guy in funny pants and wide-brimmed hat nagging Yogi Bear about harassing campers, so I started to look into it. This was back when AOL still ruled the world, and finding niche government job postings meant wading through dead links and PDFs that crashed Internet Explorer. I printed out everything I could find about wildlife management positions, and I read through them at the kitchen table, while my mom watched Wheel of Fortune in the living room. Most of the listings were full-time biologist jobs that needed a master's degree, which obviously wasn't going to happen for me. Buried under all that, there was a category for short-term wildlife services contractors. Those requirements were way more achievable. You needed a hunter education certificate, which I already had from when I was 12. They wanted a clean background check. They also wanted proof of marksmanship that they verified at a regional office, plus a sit-down with 2 field supervisors, who basically wanted to make sure you're just not a lunatic. It took me almost 8 months to actually land my first contract. I drove down to the Salt Lake City regional office in my mom's '88 Buick that overheated if you idled for too long. The 2 supervisors asked me a bunch of questions about field experience and ethics. They wanted to know what I'd do if I encountered a wounded animal that wasn't on my contract list. The more important part of the interview was just whether I came across as a reasonable and steady person. They don't want someone flaky or some adrenaline junkie alone with a rifle for 2 months at a stretch. 2 weeks later, I got a letter offering me a 30-day contract on the Wasatch Front to help control mule deer in an area where they were eating up private alfalfa fields adjacent to public land. The pay was not amazing, but it covered my expenses, and I would get to live in a little Forest Service cabin that was nicer than my bedroom at my mom's house. That contract went smooth as butter. I came in under quota, kept clean logs, and made friends with a local game warden who'd swing by every few days to check in. His name was Cal, and he ended up being the guy who recommended me for several of my contracts. After that, the work just kept coming. I did a feral hog cull down in San Juan County. Later, I helped run a coyote contract up near the Idaho border. By '94, I'd built up enough of a reputation. I was getting offered some of the longer assignments, the ones that scared off the newer guys, because they meant being out in the brush for 60 or 90 days at a time with minimal contact. And that's how I ended up taking more and more work in the Uintah Basin. The Uintah Basin sits in the northeastern corner of Utah. It's a huge stretch of high desert right along the south slope of the Uintah Mountains. The Ute Reservation takes up a massive portion of it. There's farming and ranching country out there, plus oil and gas operations that were just starting to ramp up back then when I was working there. Off the highway, it's mostly a whole lot of nothing. I liked it out there. The sky goes on forever, and the air smells like sage and wood smoke. You can drive for an hour on those access roads and pass maybe 3 other vehicles. For a guy who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his rifle and his coffee, it was paradise. The locals were polite, mostly, though some of them gave me the side-eye when they figured out I was a contracted culler. There's a particular kind of look you get from old ranchers who think the BLM is just one short step removed from communism. The way I'd usually get to know people in this line of work was through what we called crossover. The land out there is managed by a patchwork of agencies. BLM has the bulk of it. Forest Service handles the higher timber tracts. The state runs DWR with their own wardens, while the tribe manages reservation land separately with their own game wardens. Beyond all the agencies, you've also got oil surveyors and cattle leasers showing up on the same access roads. Everybody overlaps eventually. Whenever I rolled into a new area, the first thing I'd do was check in at the field station, meeting whoever was running the show. Then, over the next few weeks, I'd inevitably bump into that same handful of guys at the gas station outside Vernal, or out on the access roads themselves. We'd nod, eventually we'd talk, and after a contract or two, you'd consider some of them friends. The Forest Service guys especially were always happy to have somebody new to share a beer with after dark, since they were stuck in those bunkhouses for weeks at a time, the same as me. There were 3 guys specifically I got tight with during my Uintah Basin years. There was Wes, a Forest Service maintenance worker who had been doing the job since the late 70s, and he was the one that told us the most stories around the fire pit. Ben was about my age and worked for the state DWR doing wildlife surveys. He played skeptic to anything Wes brought up, and he would do so loudly. Then there was an older fellow named Henry, who I think was actually retired from BLM, but kept getting pulled back in for consulting work because he knew the backcountry better than the maps did. Henry was the quiet one of the bunch. He'd listen and nod, and only occasionally drop something into the conversation, but it would usually make you put your beer down on the table real careful-like. Now, Wes was the one who said that word to me. We were sitting on the steps of a Forest Service cabin somewhere south of Roosevelt, drinking warm cans of Coors because the cooler had run out of ice 3 days earlier. The sun had just dropped behind the ridge, and the sky was a deep blue, which meant the stars would soon be out. I was about 3 weeks into a contract, feeling pretty good about everything. I made some offhand comment about how the silence out there could play tricks on a man, that I'd been hearing what sounded like a woman crying off in the trees the night before, but I had told myself it was a fox or maybe a mountain lion making its weird calls. Wes's face got real serious. Where exactly were you camped?" he asked. I told him. He made a face I didn't really understand at the time, then drank some of his beer and looked out at the trees. "You might want to camp somewhere else for the rest of this contract." "Why's that?" He drank even more of his beer before answering. "Some of the locals call that ridge a Skinwalker Ridge. They don't go up there at night. Even the hunters won't." I laughed, genuinely. I thought he was messing with the new guy, doing the whole rural ghost story bit to scare the city slicker. "Wes, I grew up hunting. Pretty sure I can tell the difference between a fox and some witch." He didn't laugh back, but of course he did take another bigger drink. "Suit yourself, but if you hear that crying again, don't go looking for it." The way he said that scrubbed the smile right off my face. He sat there with his eyes on the trees, not cracking a grin and not taking back his quote-unquote joke. I changed the subject, and we ended up talking about fishing for an hour. Afterwards, I went to bed in that cabin with a weird feeling in my chest, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't double-check the door to make sure it was locked. The next morning, I told myself Wes had been pulling my leg, that he was just being colorful, but the doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, I began to pick up on little things. There was this waitress at a diner outside Vernal, who, when I mentioned I was working a contract up in a particular area, glanced at the window and changed my coffee order without comment. There was a guy at the hardware store in Duchesne who clocked the BLM patch on my hat. "You been seeing anything weird out there?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "Oh, you know what I mean." That's all I got. He rang me up without saying another word. The guys who ran the gas station near the Bottle Hollow turnoff would close a half hour earlier than the sign said and lock the door behind themselves so fast you'd think they were being chased. It was nothing concrete, nothing you could really point to in any one moment, but you start to notice when an entire region gets quiet at sundown. Ben, the DWR guy, never wanted to talk about any of it. He'd roll his eyes when Wes brought it up. He'd say it was a bunch of inbred nonsense from people who didn't have cable television, and he'd say it loud and clear every single time. I noticed, though, that Ben never volunteered to take the night surveys when those came up on the rotation. He'd swap with anyone, even pulling weekend shifts, just to keep his hours in the daylight. I even asked him about it. He just said he liked seeing what he was counting. But I don't think that was the whole story, not after knowing what I know now. Henry was different. Henry didn't deny a thing. But he wouldn't just give up the information either. You had to ask him and be clear about it. Even then, he'd turn the question around on you and want to know why you were asking, what you'd seen, what you've heard, before he'd give you a straight answer. I always got the impression he was deciding whether you could handle his answer. It took me about 2 months of running into Henry at the field station coffee pot before he finally told me a story of his own. We were both stuck inside one afternoon, waiting out a thunderstorm that had blown in fast from the west. He was sitting at the little fold-out table cleaning a knife. I was reading a paperback novel I'd already read twice. After a stretch of nothing but rain on our roof, he spoke up. "You ever hear the story about that survey crew up on Diamond Mountain in '78? "Can't say that I have, Henry." "There were 4 of them. Forest Service contractors doing a timber assessment. 2 grad students working alongside 2 professional surveyors. They were running a logging road that doesn't even exist on any current map. Got rained out about 10 days into the assignment, and ended up bunking in a Forest Service cabin, older than any of them. 4 went in, only 3 came back. The 4th was a kid named Caleb, 22 years old, out of Logan. A decent surveyor who'd done 2 seasons already." I heard a scraping sound and looked over at Henry. He had stopped what he was doing to test the edge of his knife on his thumbnail. Kinda grossed me out. Always hated sounds like that. "Now, here's the part nobody at the agency wanted in the report. The other 3 didn't lose track of Caleb during the day. He didn't wander off into the woods, didn't fall down some ravine. They were sleeping in the cabin and they all heard him get up around 3 a.m. They heard the door open and shut, and they heard him walk off into the trees. They figured he was going to take a leak, so they went back to sleep. When they woke up at dawn, his bunk was empty. The rifle he'd brought was still leaning against the wall by the door, but his boots were gone." Gotta say, that's kinda creepy. Did they ever find him? Well, they found his boots." Another scrape, scrape, scrape. Yikes. "Set neatly side by side on a flat rock in the middle of a clearing, about a quarter mile up the ridge from the cabin. Looked like somebody had taken them off and placed them right there. The ground around that rock was soft from the rain, but somehow there were no footprints leading up to it or away from it. No sign of how Caleb or anyone else got there or away. The boots were just sitting there." So what did the official report say? "Well, it said Caleb probably got disoriented in the storm and walked off a ledge somewhere they couldn't access. Search and rescue ran the area for a week and didn't find nothing else. The family eventually got a death certificate, and the agency had to move on." He set that knife down on the table. The part that always bothered me is that those boots had laces on them. They were tied. Whoever set them on that rock had to have untied them, taken them off, then tied them back up before placing them down." I thought about that for a moment. The rain had let up and I could hear water dripping off the eaves of the cabin in a slow, tired rhythm. Do you think it was a person?" I asked. "Maybe some psychopath out in the woods?" He raised an eyebrow and started to think. You want the answer that's gonna let you sleep tonight?" he said. "Or the one I actually believe?" Well, Henry never gave me the comfortable answer. "Give me the one you actually believe," I said. He set the knife down again, and he looked at the table while he talked, not at me. "Whatever set those boots on that rock wasn't a man, wasn't anything human at all, but it knew enough about us to tie the laces back up before it put them down." How's that worse than a person doing it? "Because a person doing it is a person doing it. You can hunt a person down. A person leaves prints, gets tired, sleeps somewhere eventually. Whatever did this didn't leave prints in wet ground a child could have tracked through. It didn't have to tie those laces, but it did. Caleb's family was never gonna see those boots. Nobody but the agency was gonna see them. Whoever set them on that rock tied them back up because they wanted us to know they could. They? It. They. I don't have another word that fits. What do you mean by it, Henry? He smacked his lips a couple of times, then talked. You'll know when you see it. That's not a real answer. Sorry, bud. That's all I got. Anybody who tries to tell you more than that is selling you something. I've worked out here 40 years. I've heard the stories from the locals and the tribe and the old-timers at the agency, and most of these stories don't agree with each other on a single detail except one. Every person who's told me one of those stories said the same thing at the end of it. They said, "You'll know." There was a long, quiet moment. I was trying to figure out what to say or ask to pry more information out of him. But then he said, "I'll tell you the other thing they all said. They said don't go looking for it. If you see one, you don't ever go looking for it again on purpose. Some folks have, and most of those folks aren't around anymore to talk about how it went." That's the answer, kid. That's what I've got. He went back to his knife and whatever business he had with it. I knew that was him saying, "We're done here." I went back to my cabin that night, lay in my bunk, staring at the rafters. The rain had stopped, and the silence outside felt very creepy. It was that extra silent silence after a storm. I tried telling myself I didn't believe the old guy. I had a contract to finish up. I didn't have time to believe in some ghost story. Even so, I was a bit afraid of the dark that night. Several more contracts came and went over the following months. Then in October of 1995, I got the one that ended up changing things. The BLM was running this elk reduction program in a section of foothills north of Roosevelt, where the population had grown past what the range could carry, and they wanted somebody to bring the numbers down before winter. I took it without thinking twice. There was good pay to be had on this one, and the country was beautiful. And I knew the area from a previous coyote contract I'd run 2 years before. I was glad to be back. The work itself was straightforward. I had a 30-day window, a quota of 24 animals, and access to a Forest Service cabin about 6 miles up a graded road from the highway. I spent the first week scouting the herds in the early morning and late evening. By day 8, I'd taken 5 animals and was ahead of schedule. The day this happened was a Wednesday, in mid-October. It was easy for me to remember because it was my mom's birthday. I'd called her from a payphone in Roosevelt that morning before driving back up to my position. The weather had been clear all week. The aspens were peak yellow, and the air had a cold, dry edge to it. The snow line was starting to creep down the Uintas. I was set up on a low ridge overlooking a long meadow that ran along a creek bottom. The ridge was about 60 feet above the meadow, and from where I was, I could see about half a mile of the creek in either direction. Pine forest came in close on the far side. Aspens ran up the draws. My rifle was on a bipod, and I had the scope dialed in for the meadow's far edge, where a good bull had been showing up every other evening for the last 3 days. The light was just starting to soften, maybe an hour and a half before sunset. I had a thermos of coffee right next to me, and I was being patient. Patience is half the job on these contracts. I caught movement first in my peripheral vision, off to my left, way off where I hadn't been watching. Something was coming through the aspens above the creek and moving fast. Here come the elk, I thought. Maybe the herd had pushed a cow ahead of them and she was running. I swung the scope around. 2 women. 2 women were running through the aspens, moving downhill toward the meadow, both of them clearly in distress. The one in front was wearing a red fleece jacket and had dark hair and a long ponytail that was coming loose. The one behind her had on a green hiking pack and a navy beanie. She was struggling to keep up, but I could tell both of them were crying. Even at that distance, I could see it through my scope. Open mouths, twisted faces, that look of being past scared and into terrified territory. My first thought was that one of them was hurt. I scanned them for blood or limping, but I didn't see a sign of a wound. They were running flat out, panicked, looking back over their shoulders every few steps. I scanned behind them, up into the aspens. That's when I saw it. There was a figure following them. I thought it was a man at first, or it looked like a man at least. He was tall, walking down the slope through the aspens, maybe 50 yards behind the two women. He was naked from the waist up. I want to say his skin was the color of bone, but that isn't quite right either. It was the color of dry pine, weathered, the color of something that had been outside for a season too long. He wasn't running. The two women were running, but he wasn't, and yet he was keeping up with them. That was the first thing my brain registered as completely wrong. He was walking, they were full-on sprinting, and the distance between them was staying exactly the same. I held the scope on this man, and I tried to focus. His face, I have to talk about that face. The left side, looking at him through the scope, was a young guy, somewhere in his 20s, with brown hair grown out a little, a normal jawline, a regular face you'd pass 100 times in town and never look at twice. The right side, however, was wrong. I didn't have words for it then. I still don't, really. The right side of his face was longer than the left. The jaw on that side hung lower, as though the bones underneath weren't matched up. The eye on that side was bigger and set wrong. The skin around it was a color that doesn't match anything I've ever seen on something alive. There was something about the place where the two halves came together at the center of the face that made my stomach turn just looking at it. The two halves didn't agree with each other. It was like two different beings had been stitched onto the same skull, and each one was ignoring the other. I lowered the scope and looked at the meadow with my naked eye. The two women were still running. I could see them now without the scope. Two small, desperate figures crossing the open grass, the red one out in front. I looked back to where I'd seen the man, but I could no longer pick him out without the scope. He was gone or hidden in the trees. I put the scope back to my eye. There he was. He was still there, the same distance behind them, and the same walking pace, never breaking stride. His ribcage rose and fell slowly, slower than any breathing I'd ever watched on anything alive. I'm a culler. My instinct is to put the rifle on a threat. I had a clear line of sight if I'd wanted it. I'll tell you something honest. I could not make myself center the crosshairs on him. Every time I tried to bring the scope onto his head, my hands started to shake. I'm not exaggerating. I've shot hundreds of animals. I've held a scope steady on a charging boar, but I could not put the crosshairs on that thing's face. My body just refused. The two women had reached the creek. The one in front was looking for a place to cross, frantic and splashing into the shallow part. The one behind her caught up, and they crossed together, water up to their knees, both of them stumbling. They came out the other side and kept running, heading for the road, which was about 200 yards beyond the meadow on my side. I swung the scope back to the figure. He had stopped at the edge of the aspens above the creek. He was looking down at the water. From my angle, I could see the wrong side of his face better now. and the longer I looked at it, the less I could focus on it. My eyes so badly wanted to look away at something, especially the normal half of his face. Looking at the wrong half made my brain feel raw and sore, as if I was pressing on something I should never touch. Then he turned his head. His head turned slow, and he looked across the meadow, across the creek, right up the ridge to where I was lying flat with my rifle. He looked at me through the scope, and I want to be very clear. He looked through the scope. He did not look at the ridge generally. He did not scan the area around me. He locked onto the front lens of my rifle scope and threw it into my eye. I held my breath. My finger was on the trigger guard, not the trigger. I couldn't move. My whole body had gone cold and stupid. It was the kind of cold you feel when you wake up at night and just know something is in the room with you, something that shouldn't be there. He smiled at me then. The normal side of his face smiled. The other side did something that I can't even describe, but at best I could say it was like a tremor, a seizure on one half of the face only. Two halves of the same face doing completely different things. Then he turned and walked back up into the aspens. I held the scope on him until the trees swallowed him up. I kept it on the spot he'd disappeared into until my arms began to ache. When I finally lowered the rifle and got up off the ridge, my legs weren't working anymore. I slid most of the way back down the side of the ridge instead of climbing down. I got into my truck with my hands shaking, and I drove back to the cabin without remembering most of the road in between. I called dispatch from the cabin radio. I told them I had seen two female hikers running scared out of an area where there shouldn't have been hikers. I told them they'd been heading toward the highway, but they looked like they were in trouble. I gave them the location, the time, and a description of the two. One a red fleece, the other a green pack, and they both looked maybe in their late 20s. I wanted to say something about the man, but I didn't know how I could. I sat with the radio mic in my hand trying to find the right words, but eventually I just signed off. 2 hours later, dispatch called me back. They'd found the women, thankfully, both safe, picked up by a sheriff's deputy on the highway, about 3 miles south of where I'd seen them cross the creek. They were shaken up, but unhurt. They told the deputy they'd been hiking and got lost. Then they got scared because they thought they heard something following them in the woods. The deputy logged it as a lost hiker incident, and that was the end of it. But that wasn't a lost hiker situation that I saw. I watched them closely through my scope. They knew exactly where they were. They were running from something specific. The next day, I drove down to the BLM field office in Roosevelt and asked to speak to my supervisor. He was a guy named Blum. He was in his 50s, ex-military, polite enough, but never anything you'd call warm. He took me into his office and shut the door. I told him everything I'd seen, walking him through it slowly, play by play. I told him, of course, about the two women in the meadow, and about the figure that had come down through the aspens behind them. I told him about the face being wrong on one side, and about how the figure had stopped at the edge of the trees and turned to look directly at me through my scope. Blum listened without interrupting. He nodded a couple of times. He took a few notes on a yellow pad. When I finished, he set the pen down and folded his hands on his desk. "You doing okay out there?" he said. That wasn't the response I expected. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you sleeping enough out there?" You eating good? You've been on this contract by yourself for what? Almost 2 weeks now. I sleep fine, sir. I eat good, and I know what I saw. Blum picked up the pen again and tapped it against his pad, but he didn't write down anything. Then he started in gently. Tell me what you've been eating out there, he said. What? Out at the cabin. Walk me through a day for you. Breakfast, lunch, what you carry in your pack. Blum, I don't see what that has to do with anything. Just humor me. I told him. Coffee in the morning, jerky and a granola bar in the pack. Whatever I cooked at the cabin in the evening, usually canned chili or pasta. He nodded along with every part of it. Do you ever get lightheaded out there? Hands shaky on the rifle? Anything like that? 2 weeks alone in the field, eating like that, a man can run his blood sugar pretty low without realizing it. My hands weren't shaky. What time of day did you see this? Maybe an hour and a half before sunset, but the light was still good. Right around the time the light starts doing things. You ever notice that? That hour when the shadows get long, you can pick up movement out of the corner of your eye that isn't really there, especially through a scope. Especially when you've had a scope to your eye for an hour or two waiting on a bull. The brain gets tired, you start filling things in. You know. I sat there and listened to him do this. I'd been on enough contracts to know what was happening. He wasn't asking me questions. He was offering me an explanation, gently, almost coaxing me into it. He wanted me to walk out of his office having decided what I saw was some mirage caused by tiredness. Blum, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not tired. My blood sugar is fine, and I know what I saw. There was a flicker of something on his face, a half-second where the concerned supervisor look slipped, and something else had come through. There was nothing surprised about it. The flicker instead was annoyance. A man hoping he wouldn't have to do the next part of his job. It came and went so fast I nearly missed it. Then that fake concern was back on his face. Tell you what, take a couple of days, stay at the cabin or head home, my treat. I'll cover you with the contract office. I've seen plenty of guys need a breather around the 2-week mark. Not a big deal, just think about it, okay? I don't need days off. I didn't ask you, son. I'm offering. You think about it. Then he leaned forward. And in the meantime, do me a favor. Don't talk about this with anybody. I'm not just talking about the guys at the field stations. I mean anybody at all, including the locals in town, including your own mother on the phone. The agency has its own process for this kind of thing, and I don't want the reports to get muddied. That part gave me chills. Blum was a man who said things directly, never with much heat behind them. This time there was something behind his words, a little bit of warning, a little bit of pressure, almost a threat. This man wasn't asking me to keep quiet. He was telling me. I told him I'd think about it. I left his office and walked out to my truck, sitting there in the cab. I had to make myself turn the key. I knew. By the time I was driving back to the cabin, I knew it for sure. Blum had not been surprised by my story. He had been waiting on it. Maybe not from me specifically, but he'd been waiting for someone to come into his office with a story like the one I had just told him. And he had a script ready. A script he'd run through in order. That night I sat in the cabin and just thought. Henry's story kept coming back at me. The boots set out on that rock with the laces tied. Caleb walking out the cabin door at 3 a.m. and never being seen again. And under all of it sat the figure across the meadow, looking right up at the ridge at me, smiling with half of a face that did not agree with itself. The thing that stuck with me hardest was that smile. He'd known I was there, from a quarter-mile of cover, with nothing showing but the front lens of a rifle scope. He had known, and he wanted me to know that he knew. That was the start of me believing. I tried to convince myself the worst of it was over. Blum had told me to take a couple of days off, and I figured I'd use them to clear my head. I'd stay at the cabin, finish out the rest of the contract, and put what happened behind me. The smarter version of me would have packed up that night, driven back to my mom's house in Salt Lake. The version of me sitting in that cabin in 1995 was 24 years old and stubborn, and did not want to walk away from a contract he was already halfway through. That first night was when things started to feel wrong in an entirely different way. After staying in that cabin long enough, I knew its sounds. The floorboards settled when the temperature dropped, and there was a squirrel in the rafters that ran across the roof at sunrise. I'd gotten used to all of it and slept through it just fine. That first night was different. I lay in the bunk with my eyes open until past 1 in the morning. Every time I started to drift off, my brain would replay the figure standing at the edge of the aspens, looking up the ridge through my scope, and I'd be wide awake again. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and got up to make coffee. That's when I heard the first thing. It came from the woods behind the cabin, about 20 yards in the pines. I heard a voice from the trees, a woman's voice calling out, hurt and trying to be heard. She was calling out a name. She was begging for someone to come find her. I stood there listening with the coffee pot in my hand, and something under my conscious brain started to slow me down. The voice was a little too clear. Out in those woods, 20 yards back in the pines, you wouldn't hear a person calling that clean. The trees and brush should have softened it. The wind should have carried pieces of it away. The voice I was hearing was coming through with no interference at all, as clean as a recording. Then I caught myself. I sat there in the cabin with the coffee pot in my hand. I hadn't moved. My body had already known something I hadn't worked out yet. I was a quarter-mile up a graded road from the highway, on a section of Forest Service land where there were no trailheads inside 3 miles. The closest residence was 8 miles south. There shouldn't have been a hiker at 2 in the morning, 20 yards from my cabin. There definitely shouldn't have been one yelling for help in a perfect, clear voice from the middle of the trees. I set the coffee pot down. I didn't go to the radio or the door. I sat down on the floor with my back to the wall facing the door, and I picked up my rifle. I waited. The voice kept calling for about 10 minutes, then it stopped. I sat by the wall with the rifle across my lap until the sun came up. I never heard anything else. The night stayed silent until light came through the window. In the morning, I made myself drive into Roosevelt for breakfast. The diner was open. I had eggs and coffee and tried to act normal. The waitress was a woman named Dee, who had served me on every contract I'd worked out of Roosevelt going back 2 years. She filled my cup and asked how the elk hunt was going. I told her it was going fine. She looked at me a bit longer than usual, topped my cup off again even though it didn't need it, and walked away without saying another word. I left her a bigger tip than I usually left, and I got out of there. I kept thinking about what Blum had said about not talking to anyone. I assumed he told me that for 2 reasons. The agency wanted to control the story, sure, but underneath that, he'd been warning me about something else, something he'd let slip without meaning to. That something else was the part I couldn't shake. Blum had told me not to mention it, as if mentioning it out loud would make it worse, as if speaking about the thing was part of the problem. I drove out to the field station that afternoon, and I looked for Henry. He wasn't there. The duty officer told me Henry had wrapped up his last consulting day and had gone home, so he wasn't expected back. I asked for a phone number. The duty officer said agency policy didn't allow him to give that out. I drove back to my cabin and sat on the porch step with my rifle across my knees, and I watched the tree line until the light went. That night was quiet, and the night after that was too. I started to think maybe the first night had been a fluke, a bad night and nothing more. Day 3 after the meeting, I went back out to my position on the ridge. I needed to finish the contract. The bull I'd been waiting on had been showing up regular, and I had a quota to meet. I told myself I was being a professional, and that I wasn't going to let one bad night cost me the second half of my pay. I set up. I got prone behind the rifle. I scanned the meadow. The bull came up out of the trees on schedule, big 6-point, exactly where I'd been expecting him. I had him in the scope, breathing slow, finger on the trigger guard. Then he picked his head up and looked across the meadow. He was looking at the same edge of aspens where that figure had been 3 days before. His ears swiveled forward. His whole body went stiff. He wasn't grazing anymore. He was watching something. I held very still. I didn't put the scope on the aspens. Whatever that bull saw, I didn't want anything to do with it. After about 30 seconds, the bull turned and walked back into the trees on his side of the meadow. He wasn't running, just walking, head still turned toward the aspens until he was out of sight. I packed up, and I went back to the cabin. That night would be another bad night. It started around midnight. I was in bed, but not asleep. I'd been keeping the rifle on the bunk next to me since the first night. I heard footsteps on the porch. A single set of footsteps came across the porch and stopped at the door. I lay there with my hand on the rifle and my heart trying to climb out of my chest. The footsteps had been heavy, the weight of a man. Then I heard breathing. It was right on the other side of the door, slow, slower than any breathing should be. It was the same slow breath I'd watched on the figure across the meadow when he'd been walking down the slope through the aspens. I didn't move or speak. I didn't even reach for the rifle, even though it was right there, because some part of me had already understood that picking up the rifle would make this worse. I lay there with my eyes on the door and listened to it breathe. It stayed at the door for I don't know how long. Eventually, the breathing stopped. I never heard footsteps go back across the porch. The breathing was there and then it wasn't, and the porch was empty. I waited for the sun. When the light came through the curtains, I made myself open the door. The porch was empty. I checked the dust on the boards for prints and found none. Whatever had stood there had not left a single mark, just like Henry's story. That morning was when I packed up. I left the cabin and drove back to my mom's house in Salt Lake. I called Blum from her kitchen phone and told him I was taking the rest of those days he'd offered. He sounded relieved. He told me to take a week if needed. For the first few nights at my mom's place, I slept with the lights on. I know she noticed, but she didn't ask why. She knew something had happened on the contract. After all, she had raised me. She could read me. But all I said was that it had been a hard one, and I was tired. She made me French toast, my favorite. I tried Henry one more time. I called the field station one day. but they said they'd pass on a message because he wasn't there. But he called me back 2 days later from a payphone in Vernal. I explained everything that had happened at the cabin. The voice from the trees, the bull staring at the aspens, the footsteps and breathing. I told him about the dust on the boards in the morning, how it had not been touched. He listened intently. I could hear traffic on his end. He was on a payphone near a road. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a moment and said,
"You stopped talking about it, didn't you?"
"After Blum's office, yeah, I kept it shut."
"That's good. You keep it shut. The thing you saw out there knows you saw it because you were looking at it through that scope. It locks onto attention. You stop giving it any. Far as anybody outside this conversation is concerned, that meadow never happened. You hear me?"
"Yeah."
"Did anything follow you home from that cabin?"
I told him I didn't think so. I'd checked the truck before I left. I hadn't heard anything I couldn't explain since I got back to my mom's.
"Good. That part is important. Sometimes one of them latches on, and the people that happens to don't get to live normal anymore. They have to do other things to break it loose. You don't sound like one of them."
What kind of other things? He ignored that question. Maybe by accident, maybe on purpose.
"The rest is gonna fade. Give it a few weeks. Long as you don't talk about it, and you don't sit on it in your head, it goes back to whatever it does when nobody's paying attention. But it remembers you, so you keep watching just in case."
What do you mean by watching? He took a breath on the other end.
"You'll know."
That was all he gave me. He told me to call him if anything else happened, and not to call him if it didn't. We hung up. Henry was right about it fading. I went back out 2 weeks later and finished the elk contract, and I didn't see anything I couldn't explain. I came in under quota, got my pay, and accepted the next contract that came up. I worked the Uintah Basin for another 9 years after that. I never saw anything as clear as what I'd seen in that meadow. There were nights I felt watched. Some mornings I'd find tracks near my cabin or near my truck that didn't match any animal I ever knew. But nothing ever came close to what I'd seen across that creek. I followed Henry's rules. I didn't talk about it with anyone, including my mom. Not even when I was dating somebody serious. When someone at a hardware store or bar mentioned the word in passing, I'd nod and change the subject. For about 30 years, I kept my word. I stayed quiet, kept working contracts in the basin until I aged out of the long ones. Then I worked shorter contracts in northern Utah until I retired in 2018. I had a couple of long-term relationships but never married, never had kids. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand. I've thought a lot about whether to say anything. I made a choice to stay quiet for almost 30 years, so when I tell you I'm choosing to break that silence now, understand it's not on a whim. I'm reaching out now because I'm getting older, and I've been thinking too much. I think about the people in that BLM office who knew exactly what I was reporting and decided to feed me a line about blood sugar. I keep coming back to Caleb's family who got a death certificate and some story about a ledge. And I think about those 2 women in the meadow who got logged as a lost hiker incident and probably went home trying to convince themselves that what they saw was a bear or a man with a knife. So what I want to tell you is that the government knows. Put that on record. The agencies know about it, all of them, and somebody well above Blum's pay grade has been managing the story for longer than I've been alive. I'd bet good money on it that it goes back further than that. A lot further. People who report things get the blood sugar lecture and the offer of a couple days off. People who push back get nudged toward signing something or going home for good. The people who could have told this story alongside me are mostly gone. Wes died in 2014, Henry in 2008, and Ben moved to Arizona 27 years ago. I've never been able to find him since. Henry was the only one I ever told the full story to, and he was the only person who ever told me how to handle what comes after. I'm breaking my silence now because Henry is not around to tell me to keep my mouth shut anymore. 30 years go by. He told me to keep watching just in case, and I've kept watching because there are skinwalkers in those woods. It's crazy how you don't even need much action or face-to-face terror in a skinwalker story like this to walk away feeling like you need 3 showers a day and twice the wattage in every light fixture in your home. Remember, when you speak of them, they will come. So be careful what you say. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails, and I need your help. If you want EerieCast and Tales from the Break Room to keep going, think about signing up for membership over at eerie.fm. That's EERIE.fm. It's the new best place to listen to EerieCast shows like this. And if you sign up for premium, you unlock tons of extra hours of my narrations that you can't get anywhere else. Thank you so much. Until next time, everyone, I'll be clocking out, but I'll be back again real soon.